In the shadows of gilded corridors and behind closed palace doors, loyalty can become betrayal in a single heartbeat. What happens when a trusted royal guard stumbles upon evidence that could topple a kingdom's most carefully guarded secret? Sometimes the greatest threats to the crown come not from foreign enemies, but from those who sleep within the palace walls themselves. This is the story of Prince Alexander's discovery that would forever change the fate of the kingdom of Valdoria, and the woman he once called mother. The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Valdoria Palace like forgotten memories refusing to fade. Captain Marcus Reed had walked these corridors for 15 years, his boots echoing against marble floors that had witnessed centuries of royal secrets. As head of the Royal Protection Unit, Marcus had seen enough palace intrigue to fill a dozen novels, but nothing had prepared him for what he would discover on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning. The palace stirred to life as servants moved silently through the halls, preparing for another day in service to the royal family. King Edmund sat on the throne, a man weathered by years of rule and personal tragedy. His son, Prince Alexander, had grown into a strong leader at 32, respected by the people and trusted by his father. But it was Queen Consort Vivian who commanded the most attention, a woman who had married into the family 10 years ago and slowly woven herself into the very fabric of palace life. Marcus had always found something unsettling about Queen Vivian, though he could never quite put his finger on what bothered him. She was charming, intelligent, and seemingly devoted to her stepson Alexander. The people adored her charitable work and her graceful presence at state functions. Yet there were moments, fleeting glances, whispered conversations that stopped when he approached, late-night meetings in her private chambers, that made his instincts as a security professional prickle with unease. The discovery began innocently enough. Marcus was conducting his routine morning security sweep when he noticed the door to Queen Vivian's private study was slightly ajar. This was unusual, as she was meticulous about locking her personal spaces. Palace protocol required him to secure any unsecured rooms, so he approached carefully, his hand instinctively moving to the radio on his belt. As he pushed the door open, Marcus expected to find the elegant study empty, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and antique mahogany desk arranged perfectly as always. Instead, he found evidence of hasty departure, papers scattered across the desk, a safe hidden behind a false panel standing open, and most shocking of all, a passport lying forgotten on the Persian rug. But this wasn't just any passport. As Marcus bent to examine it, his blood ran cold. The document bore Queen Vivian's photograph, but the name read Victoria Marinelli, and the country of origin was listed as Saravia, a nation that had been in bitter diplomatic conflict with Valdoria for decades. The birth date was different too, making her 5 years older than she had claimed when she married the king. Marcus's mind raced as he processed the implications. He carefully photographed the passport with his secure phone before replacing it exactly where he had found it. His years of intelligence training kicked in as he methodically searched the study, finding more disturbing evidence: encrypted communications with foreign contacts, financial records showing mysterious payments from offshore accounts, and most damning of all, detailed floor plans of the palace's most secure areas, including the king's private quarters and the crown jewel vault. The weight of his discovery pressed down on Marcus like a physical force. Queen Vivian wasn't who she claimed to be. She was potentially a foreign agent who had somehow infiltrated the highest levels of Valdoria's government through marriage. Every state dinner she had attended, every private conversation she had overheard, every moment of access she had gained to the royal family's most sensitive information, it all took on a sinister new meaning. As Marcus carefully restored the study to its original appearance, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. His heart pounded as he recognized the distinct click of Queen Vivian's heels against the marble floor. He quickly moved to the window, pretending to check the security latches as she entered the room. "Captain Reed!" Her voice was honey smooth as always, but Marcus now detected something else underneath. A calculated coolness that he had somehow missed before. "Is everything all right? I saw you in here and wanted to make sure there wasn't a security concern." "Just conducting the routine morning sweep, Your Majesty," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I noticed the door was unlocked and wanted to ensure everything was secure." Queen Vivian moved gracefully to her desk, her eyes quickly scanning the surface. Marcus watched as her gaze lingered on the spot where the passport had been lying. For just a moment, her composed mask slipped, and he saw something dangerous flash in her eyes. "How thorough of you," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I must have forgotten to lock it last night. I was working late on some charitable foundation paperwork." Marcus nodded politely and excused himself. but he could feel her watching him as he left. His training told him that his cover might already be blown. Queen Vivian was clearly intelligent and observant. There was a good chance she would notice that her papers had been photographed, despite his careful efforts to avoid detection. As he made his way through the palace corridors, Marcus wrestled with his next move. Protocol dictated that he should report directly to his superior, Colonel Harrison, who oversaw all palace security operations. But Marcus had learned to trust his instincts, and something told him that this conspiracy might run deeper than just Queen Vivian. How had she managed to pass through what should have been extensive background checks when she married the king? Who else might be involved in whatever operation she was running? The morning continued with its usual rhythm: briefings with junior officers, coordination with the palace staff, routine security updates. But underneath the normalcy, Marcus felt the weight of his terrible knowledge. Every time he saw Queen Vivian smile at Prince Alexander, every moment she spent in conversation with King Edmund, he wondered what information she might be gathering, what secrets she might be passing along to her handlers. Marcus decided he needed more evidence before making any accusations. A single passport, however damning, might not be enough to convince the royal family that they had been harboring a potential spy for 10 years. He began discreetly investigating Queen Vivian's background, using his security clearance to access files that had been compiled when she first arrived at court. The official story was that Victoria, or Vivian, as she preferred to be called, was the daughter of a minor Italian nobleman who had been educated in Switzerland and had worked for various European charitable organizations before meeting King Edmund at a diplomatic reception in Monaco. The paperwork all seemed to be in order, but Marcus's trained eye began to notice subtle inconsistencies, dates that didn't quite align, references that seemed vague, and, most troubling of all, a complete absence of any digital footprint before her arrival in Valdoria. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself observing Queen Vivian more carefully. She moved through her royal duties with practiced ease, meeting with charitable organizations, reviewing state dinner preparations, discussing upcoming diplomatic events with the palace staff. But now Marcus noticed things he had missed before: the way she positioned herself during meetings to overhear conversations, how she asked seemingly innocent questions about security procedures, and most telling of all, how she always seemed to know more about palace operations than someone in her position should. The afternoon brought an unexpected development when Marcus received a call from the palace's IT security team. They had detected unusual network activity from Queen Vivian's private quarters the previous night, encrypted data transmissions that had somehow bypassed their normal security protocols. The timing coincided perfectly with when Marcus had found her study in disarray. As evening approached, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't wait any longer to act on his suspicions. The evidence was mounting, and every hour that passed was another hour that Queen Vivian could continue whatever operation she was running. But he also knew that making accusations against a beloved member of the royal family would require absolute proof and careful handling. Marcus decided to approach Prince Alexander directly. As the heir to the throne and someone who would be most affected by this betrayal, Alexander deserved to know the truth. But it would have to be done carefully, away from prying eyes and potential surveillance. The opportunity came during the evening security briefing. Marcus requested a private moment with Prince Alexander, ostensibly to discuss updates to his personal protection detail. They met in the prince's private office, a room that Marcus knew was regularly swept for surveillance devices. "Your Highness," Marcus began carefully, "I've discovered something that requires your immediate attention. It concerns Queen Vivian, and I'm afraid the implications are quite serious." Prince Alexander's expression grew concerned as Marcus laid out his discoveries: the false passport, the suspicious financial records, the encrypted communications, and the IT security breaches. With each piece of evidence, the prince's face grew paler, the weight of betrayal settling on his shoulders. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Alexander asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I've documented everything, sir. The evidence is overwhelming. Queen Vivian is not who she claims to be, and her activities suggest she may be engaged in espionage against the crown." The prince sat in stunned silence for several moments, processing the magnitude of what he had just learned. The woman who had been part of his family for 10 years, who had comforted him after his mother's death, who had stood by his father's side through difficult times. She was potentially an enemy agent. "What do you recommend?" Alexander asked finally. "We need to act quickly but carefully," Marcus replied. "If she suspects we know about her true identity, she might try to flee the country or destroy additional evidence. I suggest we secure her passport immediately and begin a comprehensive investigation." As the two men discussed their next moves, neither realized that Queen Vivian was already one step ahead of them. She had indeed noticed the subtle signs that her study had been searched, and her network of contacts had already been alerted to prepare for emergency extraction. The game of cat and mouse was about to begin in earnest. The first part of this explosive story ends with Prince Alexander and Captain Reed planning their confrontation with Queen Vivian. Unaware that she had already begun implementing her escape plan, the foundations of the Valdorian monarchy were about to be shaken to their very core, and nothing would ever be the same again. The sleepless night that followed Captain Reed's revelation felt like the longest of Prince Alexander's life. He sat in his private chambers, staring at copies of the evidence that Marcus had compiled, trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the spy, who had apparently been living among them for a decade. The false passport bearing the name Victoria Marinelli felt like a physical weight in his hands, each detail a reminder of how thoroughly they had all been deceived. Alexander's mind wandered back to his father's wedding day 10 years ago. He had been 22 then, still grieving his mother's death from cancer. 2 years earlier, Queen Vivian had seemed like a godsend, elegant, compassionate, and genuinely caring toward both him and his father. She had never tried to replace his mother, but had carved out her own place in their lives with patience and grace. Or so he had thought. Now, every memory felt tainted. Had her tears during his mother's memorial service been genuine or calculated manipulation? When she had stayed up all night helping him prepare for his first major diplomatic mission, had she been offering support or gathering intelligence? The thought made his stomach turn. As dawn broke over the palace grounds, Alexander made his decision. He would conduct his own investigation before confronting his stepmother directly. If Queen Vivian truly was a foreign agent, he needed to understand the full scope of her operation and identify any other potential conspirators within the palace walls. His first stop was the Royal Archives, a vast underground repository of documents that chronicled centuries of Valdorian history. Alexander had always enjoyed spending time among the ancient texts and historical records, but today he was searching for something specific. The files related to his father's courtship and marriage to Queen Vivian. The archivist, an elderly man named Professor Whitmore, who had served the royal family for over 40 years, was surprised to see the prince so early in the morning. "Your Highness, how can I assist you today?" "I need to review the documentation from my father's marriage to Queen Vivian," Alexander said carefully. "I'm researching our family history for an upcoming speech." Professor Whitmore nodded and disappeared into the maze of filing cabinets and storage rooms. When he returned, he carried a thick folder containing everything from the initial background check reports to wedding planning documents. Alexander's heart sank as he realized how extensive the deception must have been. The background check seemed thorough on the surface, but Alexander's training in statecraft and his conversations with Captain Reed had taught him what to look for. The references were all from organizations that had since been dissolved or restructured. The educational credentials came from institutions that had undergone significant changes in their record-keeping systems. It was as if Queen Vivian's entire history had been carefully constructed to be believable but unverifiable. More troubling still were the diplomatic cables from the time period when his father first met Vivian. Alexander had security clearance to access these documents, and what he found made his blood run cold. Saravia, Queen Vivian's true country of origin, according to the false passport, had been particularly active in their intelligence operations against Valdoria during that exact time period. There had been several documented attempts to infiltrate various levels of government, though none as audacious as what appeared to be a successful penetration of the royal family itself. Alexander spent hours poring over the documents, building a timeline that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Queen Vivian's arrival in Monaco, where she met King Edmund, coincided perfectly with a major Saravian intelligence conference that had been monitored by Valdorian security services. Her charitable work, which had seemed so admirable, had given her access to government officials, business leaders, and foreign diplomats throughout Europe. By midday, Alexander knew he needed help. He contacted his most trusted advisor, Lord Chancellor Margaret Thornfield, a woman who had served the crown for 25 years and whose loyalty was beyond question. They met in the secure conference room deep within the palace, a location that was regularly swept for surveillance devices and was considered completely secure. "Margaret," Alexander began without preamble, "I need to share something with you that could have profound implications for the monarchy." Lord Thornfield listened in stunned silence as Alexander laid out the evidence against Queen Vivian. Her expression grew increasingly grave as the full scope of the potential betrayal became clear. My God, she whispered when he finished. If this is true, she's had access to state secrets, diplomatic communications, even our most sensitive military information through her proximity to your father. That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Alexander replied. But we need to be absolutely certain before we take any action. An accusation like this, if we're wrong, could destroy the monarchy's credibility and my father's health. Lord Thornfield agreed to help with the investigation, using her extensive network of contacts within the government to discreetly verify information about Queen Vivian's background. She also arranged for a team of intelligence experts to review all communications and activities associated with the Queen Consort over the past several years. Meanwhile, Alexander decided to test Queen Vivian directly, albeit carefully. That evening at dinner, he began asking seemingly casual questions about her past, probing for inconsistencies in the story she had maintained for so long. The royal family's evening meal was typically an intimate affair when no official guests were present. King Edmund, Queen Vivian, and Prince Alexander would discuss the day's events and upcoming obligations in a relaxed setting that had always felt like a safe haven to the prince. Tonight, however, the familiar dining room felt charged with tension that only Alexander could perceive. "Vivian," he said casually as they were served the main course, "I was thinking about your work with the Children's Relief Foundation before you came to Valdoria. Whatever happened to your colleague, Dr. Martinez? You mentioned he was such an inspiration to your philanthropic efforts." Alexander watched Queen Vivian's face carefully as he spoke. For just a moment, he saw confusion flicker in her eyes, the look of someone trying to recall a fictional story rather than a real memory. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough to escape his notice. "Oh, Dr. Martinez," she said with a practiced smile. "Yes, he was wonderful. I believe he moved to South America to work with indigenous communities. We lost touch after I married your father, unfortunately." Alexander nodded, as if satisfied with the answer, but he made mental notes of every detail. Later that evening, he would task Lord Thornfield's team with investigating whether Dr. Martinez had ever existed at all. The conversation continued with similarly probing questions about Queen Vivian's childhood in Italy, her education in Switzerland, and her early charitable work. With each answer, Alexander became more convinced that he was listening to a carefully constructed legend rather than genuine memories. After dinner, Queen Vivian excused herself to attend to correspondence, and King Edmund retired to his study to review documents for the next day's cabinet meeting. Alexander found himself alone with his thoughts in the grand sitting room, staring at portraits of his ancestors and wondering how they would have handled such a crisis. His phone buzzed with a secure message from Captain Reed. "Surveillance of subjects' quarters shows preparation for possible departure. Packed luggage hidden in wardrobe. Recommend immediate action." Alexander's heart raced. If Queen Vivian was preparing to flee, it meant she either suspected she had been discovered or had received orders from her handlers to evacuate. Either way, they were running out of time. He immediately contacted Lord Thornfield, who confirmed that her preliminary investigation had found numerous red flags in Queen Vivian's background. The Children's Relief Foundation she claimed to work for did exist, Margaret reported, but there's no record of anyone named Victoria Marinelli or Vivian DeMarco ever being employed there. The Swiss university she claimed to attend has no record of her attendance. Alexander, I'm afraid Captain Reed's suspicions are correct. What about the intelligence analysis? Alexander asked. Even more disturbing. Our experts found evidence of sophisticated encryption software on her personal devices, communications with known Sarabian intelligence fronts, and financial transfers that appear to be payments for services rendered.
Your Highness, she's been living in the palace as an active spy for 10 years?
Alexander felt physically sick as the reality of their situation settled over him. His father, already weakened by years of rule and ongoing health issues, was emotionally dependent on Queen Vivian. The shock of learning about her betrayal could devastate him, possibly even trigger a health crisis, but allowing her to continue operating was equally unthinkable. We need to move tonight, Alexander decided. If she's preparing to flee, we can't give her the opportunity. I'll confront her myself and demand an explanation. Sir, is that wise? If she's truly a trained intelligence operative, she could be dangerous. I'll have Captain Reed and his team standing by, Alexander assured her, but this is something I need to do personally. She deceived my family for 10 years. She owes us the truth. As the palace settled into its evening routine, Alexander made his preparations. He arranged for additional security personnel to be positioned throughout the building, ostensibly for a routine security exercise. Captain Reed briefed his most trusted officers on the situation, ensuring they understood the sensitivity of the operation. At 10 o'clock, Alexander made his way to Queen Vivian's private suite. She had retired early, claiming fatigue from a day of charitable meetings. As he approached her door, Alexander steeled himself for what might be the most difficult conversation of his life. He knocked softly, and Queen Vivian's voice called for him to enter. She was sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair, looking every inch the elegant royal that she had appeared to be for so many years. When she saw Alexander's reflection in the mirror, her face lit up with what seemed like genuine pleasure. "Alexander, what a lovely surprise. Is everything all right? I need to speak with you about something important," he said, closing the door behind him. "Please, have a seat." Queen Vivian turned to face him, and for the first time, Alexander thought he detected wariness in her eyes. "You look very serious. Has something happened with your father?" "In a way, yes," Alexander replied. "Vivian, I know about the passport." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Alexander watched as Queen Vivian's carefully constructed mask finally slipped away completely. For several long moments they stared at each other in absolute silence. When she spoke, her voice was different, harder, with an accent that she had successfully hidden for a decade. "I suppose you think you're very clever, figuring it out after all these years. How long have you been working for Saravia?" Alexander asked, his voice steady despite the pain of confirmed betrayal. Queen Vivian, or Victoria Marinelli, laughed bitterly. "Since before I met your father. This has been my mission from the beginning, and I've been very good at it. The charitable work, the concern for our family, the tears at my mother's memorial. Was any of it real?" For just a moment, something that might have been genuine emotion flickered across her face.
"That's the thing about deep cover operations, Alexander.
Sometimes the line between the mission and reality becomes blurred. I didn't expect to care as much as I did, but not enough to stop," Alexander said. "No, not enough to stop." The confrontation was just beginning, and Alexander realized that getting the full truth from this woman who had been living a lie for 10 years would be far more complicated than he had anticipated. The woman sitting before him was a professional intelligence operative, trained in deception and manipulation. Every answer she gave would need to be carefully evaluated. "What information have you passed along?" he demanded. "Everything," she said simply. "State secrets, diplomatic plans, military capabilities, personal weaknesses of government officials, your father's health issues. Everything." The casual way she delivered this devastating revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. The woman his father loved, the woman he had considered a second mother, had been systematically betraying their country for years. As the interrogation continued deep into the night, Alexander would learn the full scope of the damage that had been done, and the difficult choices that lay ahead for the royal family and the kingdom of Valdoria. The atmosphere in Queen Vivian's private chambers had transformed from elegant royal comfort to something resembling an interrogation room. Alexander sat across from the woman he had called mother for 10 years, struggling to reconcile her calm confession with the magnitude of her betrayal. Outside, Captain Reed and his security team maintained their positions, ready to prevent any attempted escape. "I need names," Alexander said, his voice harder now than it had been at the start of their conversation. "Who are your handlers? What other operatives are working within our government?" "Victoria Marinelli." Alexander found it easier to think of her by her real name now, smiled with what seemed like genuine amusement. "You really think I'm going to give you a complete intelligence briefing? I may have been discovered, but I'm still a professional." "You've just admitted to 10 years of treason," Alexander replied. "Your career as a spy is over either way. The only question now is whether you help us understand the damage you've caused." "Is it really?" Victoria asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because it seems to me that you have a significant problem. How exactly are you planning to explain this to your father?" "To the Parliament. To the people who have loved and admired Queen Vivian for a decade." Alexander felt a chill as he realized she was right. The political implications of exposing Queen Vivian as a foreign spy were staggering. The scandal would rock the monarchy to its foundations. His father's judgment would be questioned, the security services would be investigated, and international allies would wonder what other secrets had been compromised. "You planned for this moment," he said, understanding dawning on him. "You've been setting up this leverage for years. A good intelligence operative always has an exit strategy," Victoria confirmed. "I've been preparing for the possibility of discovery from day one. The question is, are you prepared for the consequences of exposing me?" Alexander stood and moved to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where his family had lived and ruled for generations. The weight of the decision before him felt crushing. Allow Victoria to continue operating, and she would keep passing secrets to Saravia. Expose her, and the resulting scandal might destroy the monarchy entirely. What do you want? He asked finally. Safe passage out of the country, Victoria replied immediately. New identity documents, enough money to start over somewhere else, and your guarantee that my activities here will never be disclosed publicly.
In exchange for what?
My silence about certain personal information I've gathered about the royal family over the years. Information that would be devastating if it became public. Alexander turned back to face her, his expression darkening. You're blackmailing us. I prefer to think of it as negotiating a mutually beneficial arrangement, Victoria said smoothly. I disappear forever, you maintain the monarchy's reputation, and everyone moves on with their lives. Before Alexander could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Captain Reed entered discreetly, his face grim. Your Highness, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation. Our IT security team has detected multiple encrypted transmissions being sent from this wing of the palace. Someone is communicating with external contacts. Alexander's blood ran cold. When? Starting approximately 20 minutes ago. The signals are being traced, but they're using sophisticated routing protocols. Alexander looked at Victoria, who was watching the exchange with obvious satisfaction. You activated some kind of dead man switch when I came in here. Insurance policy, she confirmed. If I don't check in with my handlers at regular intervals, certain information gets released automatically. You really should give me more credit, Alexander. I've been planning for this contingency for years. What information? Alexander demanded. Victoria's smile turned predatory. Security details for every major government building in the capital, personal intelligence files on cabinet members and their families, your father's complete medical records including his recent diagnosis, and most importantly, evidence of the bribes paid to certain parliament members during the tax reform vote last year. Alexander felt the room spinning around him. If any of that information became public, it wouldn't just damage the monarchy. It could trigger a complete government collapse. You're bluffing, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Your father was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease 6 months ago. He's been taking medication that he's hidden from everyone except his personal physician and Queen Vivian. The bribes during the tax vote totaled £2.3 million, paid through a series of shell companies to 7 specific parliament members whose names I have documented. Should I continue? Alexander's legs felt weak as he realized that Victoria wasn't bluffing at all. She had access to information that could destroy not just the monarchy, but the entire political system of Valdoria. Captain Reed was watching the exchange with growing alarm. Sir, what are your orders? Before Alexander could answer, his secure phone rang. The caller ID showed Lord Thornfield's number. Margaret? Alexander, we have a major problem. Saravian military units are mobilizing along our border. Intelligence suggests they may be preparing for some kind of operation, possibly in response to signals from an asset within our government. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the full scope of the crisis becoming clear. Victoria's handlers weren't just preparing to extract her, they were using her discovery as a pretext for military action. How long do we have? He asked. Hours, maybe less. The Prime Minister is being briefed now, and the military is moving to defensive positions. Alexander, if there's any connection between this and your security investigation, I need to know immediately. Alexander looked at Victoria, who was clearly listening to every word. Her expression had shifted from smugness to concern. I'll call you back, he told Lord Thornfield and ended the call. Your handlers are using your exposure as justification for military action, he said to Victoria. For the first time since her mask had dropped, Victoria looked genuinely surprised. That's not possible. This operation was strictly intelligence gathering. There were never any plans for military involvement. Well, either you weren't told everything or your extraction has been upgraded to something much larger, Alexander replied. Either way, you've just moved from being a spy to being the catalyst for a potential war. Victoria stood abruptly and began pacing the room. Alexander could see her mind racing as she processed this development. I need to contact my handlers immediately, she said. This is not what was supposed to happen. Absolutely not, Captain Reed interjected. You're not making any more communications with foreign agents. You don't understand, Victoria snapped. If Saravia is mobilizing military units, it means someone above my operational level has decided to escalate this situation far beyond what was planned. That puts everyone in danger, including your civilian population.
Alexander found himself in the impossible position of needing to trust the enemy spy who had betrayed his family in order to prevent a war.
What exactly are you proposing? He asked. Let me contact my handlers and find out what's really happening. If this is some kind of rogue operational miscommunication, I might be able to prevent it from escalating further.
And if it's not?
If this was always the plan, Victoria met his eyes directly. Then we're all in more trouble than you realize, because it means my real mission here was never just intelligence gathering. It was preparation for invasion. The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Alexander felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about the situation was changing. 10 years, he said quietly. You've been preparing for an invasion for 10 years? I don't know, Victoria admitted. And for the first time, she sounded genuinely uncertain. I was told this was a long-term intelligence operation, but if military units are mobilizing in response to my exposure, it suggests there were always larger plans that I wasn't briefed on. Captain Reed stepped forward. Sir, I recommend we place her under immediate arrest and begin emergency protocols. Whatever's happening with Saravia, we can't trust anything she says. But we also can't ignore the possibility that she's the only one who can help us understand what we're facing, Alexander countered. His phone rang again. This time it was his father. Alexander, where are you? Margaret tells me there's some kind of crisis developing with Saravia. I need you in the situation room immediately. I'll be right there, father. Alexander looked at Victoria and Captain Reed. He had to make a decision that could determine the fate of his kingdom. Marcus, place her under house arrest, but allow her to make one supervised communication with her handlers. I want to know what we're really dealing with. Sir, that's extremely risky, Captain Reed protested. Everything is risky right now, Alexander replied. But I'd rather face this crisis with information than without it. He turned to Victoria.
You have one chance to prove that there's still something human left in you after 10 years of deception.
Help us understand what's happening, and I'll consider allowing you safe passage out of the country. Betray us again, and I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life in prison. Victoria nodded solemnly. I'll help you. But Alexander, you need to understand something. If Saravia is mobilizing for military action, it means there are people in my government who view your discovery of my operation as an act of war. This situation is about to become much bigger than just one exposed spy. As Alexander left to join his father in the emergency situation room, he couldn't shake the feeling that the confrontation in Queen Vivian's chambers had just triggered a chain of events that would change Valdoria forever. The woman who had been part of his family for 10 years was now the key to preventing a war, or the catalyst for starting one. The next few hours would determine whether the Kingdom of Valdoria would survive the greatest crisis in its modern history, and whether the royal family could weather the storm that was about to break over them. The emergency situation room deep beneath the palace had never felt more claustrophobic. King Edmund sat at the head of the table, his face ashen as reports flooded in from intelligence services and military commanders. The large wall screens displayed satellite images of Saravian troops mobilizing along the border, their movements coordinated and purposeful in a way that suggested months of preparation. Prince Alexander entered the room to find his father surrounded by the kingdom's top officials, Prime Minister Davidson, Defense Secretary Coleman, and Intelligence Chief Morrison. Lord Thornfield caught Alexander's eye and nodded toward an empty chair beside her. Alexander, King Edmund said without looking up from the briefing papers before him. What's this about a security issue at the palace? Margaret mentioned you were conducting some kind of investigation. The weight of what Alexander had to reveal pressed down on him like a physical force. His father looked older than his 68 years, the stress of rule having taken its toll over the past decade. The news that his beloved wife was a foreign spy might literally kill him. Father, there's something I need to tell you about Queen Vivian, Alexander began carefully. It's going to be difficult to hear. King Edmund's head snapped up, his eyes sharp with sudden concern. What about Vivian? Is she hurt? Where is she? She's safe, Alexander assured him quickly. But we've discovered that she's not who she claims to be. For the next 20 minutes, Alexander laid out the evidence that Captain Reed had uncovered and the confession he had extracted from Victoria Marinelli. The room fell silent except for the occasional sharp intake of breath from one of the officials. King Edmund's face went through a series of changes: confusion, disbelief, denial, and finally, devastating comprehension. You're telling me, the king said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, That my wife of 10 years is a Saravian spy? Yes, father. King Edmund aged a decade in that single moment. The man who had ruled Valdoria with strength and wisdom for over 30 years suddenly looked fragile and broken. Alexander reached out to steady his father as the king swayed slightly in his chair. My God, Prime Minister Davidson breathed. The security implications are staggering. She's had access to cabinet meetings, state dinners with foreign leaders, classified briefings. She's admitted to passing along everything. Alexander confirmed grimly. State secrets, military capabilities, personal intelligence on government officials, everything. Defense Secretary Coleman leaned forward aggressively. We need to arrest her immediately and begin damage assessment. This is the worst security breach in our nation's history. It's more complicated than that, Alexander said. He explained Victoria's threats about releasing additional classified information and her claims about having evidence of corruption within Parliament. Intelligence Chief Morrison whistled low. She's turned this into a hostage situation. If we expose her, she brings down the government. If we don't, she continues operating. There's another problem, Lord Thornfield interjected. She activated one of the wall screens, showing real-time satellite footage of the Saravian border. The military mobilization began within hours of her exposure being discovered. This suggests either incredible coordination or that this was always part of a larger plan. King Edmund had been listening in stunned silence, but now he spoke with a voice that carried the authority of decades of rule despite his obvious pain. I want to speak with her now. Father, I don't think that's wise, Alexander began. She was my wife for 10 years, the king said firmly. Whatever else she may be, I deserve to hear the truth from her directly. 20 minutes later, a heavily guarded Victoria Marinelli was escorted into the Situation Room. She had changed from her elegant evening wear into simple clothing, and without her royal jewelry and styling, she looked more like the intelligence operative she truly was. But when she saw King Edmund, her carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. Eddie, she said softly, using the private name she had called him for years. Don't. King Edmund replied harshly. You've lost the right to use that name. I want to know one thing, and I want the truth. Was any of it real? Did you feel anything for me? Or was it all just part of your mission? Victoria stood silently for a long moment, and Alexander could see genuine emotion warring with professional training on her face. I was sent here to get close to the royal family and gather intelligence, she said finally. That was my mission. But Eddie, what developed between us, that wasn't part of the plan. I didn't expect to fall in love with you. But not enough to stop betraying everything I held dear, the king said bitterly. No, Victoria admitted, not enough to stop. Prime Minister Davidson interrupted the painful exchange. We need practical solutions, not emotional confessions. Our intelligence services are reporting that Saravia appears to be preparing for a major operation. We need to know what information you've passed along that might be facilitating their planning. Victoria turned to address the room professionally. I need you to understand something that my handlers might not have made clear to me. If military action is being taken in response to my exposure, it suggests that my real mission here was never just intelligence gathering.
What do you mean? Intelligence Chief Morrison demanded.
Long-term intelligence operations like mine, deep cover assignments lasting years, they're typically used for one of two purposes, either to gather information for ongoing diplomatic and economic advantage, or to prepare for eventual military action. You're saying this has been a 10-year preparation for invasion? Defense Secretary Coleman asked. I'm saying that's now a possibility I have to consider, Victoria replied. When I was recruited and trained for this mission, I was told it was purely intelligence-focused. But if Saravia is mobilizing military units in response to my discovery, it means there were aspects of the operation that I wasn't informed about. Alexander felt sick as the implications became clear. You're telling us that for 10 years, Saravia has been using you to map our defenses, understand our capabilities, and identify our vulnerabilities, all in preparation for war? It's possible, Victoria said. The intelligence I've provided would be invaluable for military planning. Security protocols for government buildings, personal weaknesses of key officials that could be exploited. Your father's health issues which affect leadership continuity, economic and military capabilities. King Edmund slammed his hand on the table. Enough! I don't want to hear any more about how thoroughly we've been betrayed. Lord Thornfield activated another screen, showing intelligence reports from various agencies. We're receiving confirmation that Saravian military units are taking positions that would be optimal for rapid incursion across our border. This isn't just saber-rattling. They appear to be preparing for actual military action. How long do we have? King Edmund asked, forcing himself back into the role of leader, despite his personal anguish. Based on their current positioning and the logistics of moving additional forces into place, intelligence estimates we have between 18 and 36 hours before they could launch a coordinated attack, Defense Secretary Coleman reported. Then we need to mobilize our own forces immediately, the king decided. There's another option, Victoria said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. I could attempt to contact my handlers and find out exactly what's happening. If this escalation wasn't part of the original plan, I might be able to help prevent it. Absolutely not, Prime Minister Davidson said immediately. We're not going to let a foreign spy negotiate on our behalf. But I might be the only one who can reach the people making these decisions quickly enough to matter, Victoria argued. If Saravia is preparing for military action based on incomplete information or unauthorized escalation, I might be able to provide clarification that prevents unnecessary conflict. Alexander found himself in the surreal position of considering whether to trust the enemy spy who had betrayed his family to help prevent a war. What would you need? He asked. Secure communication equipment and permission to make contact with my operational chain of command. I want to find out if this military mobilization was always part of the plan or if it's a reaction to my exposure that's gotten out of control. Intelligence Chief Morrison shook his head. The security risks are enormous. Any communication she makes could provide additional intelligence to Saravia or trigger further escalation. The alternative is assuming we're facing an imminent invasion and responding accordingly, Alexander pointed out. That could trigger the very war we're trying to prevent. King Edmund looked around the table at his advisors, then at Victoria, and finally at his son. The weight of leadership and personal betrayal was evident in every line of his face. I want options, he said finally. Military options for defending against invasion, diplomatic options for diffusing the crisis, and yes, intelligence options including the possibility of using our unwilling guest here to gather more information about Saravian intentions. Over the next hour, the room became a hub of activity as various officials coordinated with their respective agencies. Military units were being moved into defensive positions. Diplomatic channels were being activated to reach Saravian leadership through third-party nations. And intelligence services were working to assess the full scope of information that Victoria had compromised over the years. Alexander found himself watching Victoria during the briefings. Despite everything she had done, despite the betrayal and the lies, he could see genuine concern on her face as the military situation developed. Whether that concern was for the people of Valdoria or simply for her own survival, he couldn't tell. Victoria, he said during a brief break in the proceedings, I need to ask you something directly. In your professional opinion, is Saravia actually prepared to go to war with us? Not just military posturing, but actual sustained conflict. She considered the question seriously. Based on the intelligence I've provided over the years, they would know that Valdoria's military capabilities are significant, but not overwhelming. They would also know about your economic vulnerabilities and the political divisions within your parliament. If they'd been planning military action, they would have confidence that they could achieve quick objectives before international intervention could be organized. What kind of objectives? Likely territorial concessions in the border regions, possibly forced renegotiation of trade agreements, and definitely a change in government that would be more favorable to Saravian interests. Alexander felt a chill of understanding. They're not just planning to invade. They're planning to occupy and restructure our government. It would make sense, Victoria confirmed. The intelligence I provided would make such an operation feasible if they moved quickly and decisively. Before Alexander could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the palace. Within moments, Defense Secretary Coleman was receiving urgent reports through his secure communication device. Saravian aircraft have violated our airspace, he announced to the room. Multiple contacts moving toward the capital. We have approximately 12 minutes before they reach the city. King Edmund stood slowly, the weight of command settling over his shoulders despite his personal anguish. Gentlemen, ladies, it appears the decision has been made for us. We are now at war. As the evacuation procedures for the royal family began, Alexander realized that the confrontation in Queen Vivian's chambers had indeed triggered the crisis that would define his generation. The question now was whether the kingdom of Valdoria would survive the storm that was breaking over them, and whether the monarchy could maintain its authority in the face of both external invasion and internal betrayal. The underground command bunker beneath the palace had been designed to withstand the worst-case scenarios that military planners could imagine. But no one had envisioned a situation quite like this. As Saravian aircraft streaked across Valdorian airspace, King Edmund found himself commanding a war effort while dealing with the devastating knowledge that his wife of 10 years had made that war possible through her systematic betrayal of state secrets. The first wave of Saravian aircraft proved to be a feint, reconnaissance flights designed to test Valdorian air defenses and gather final intelligence before the main assault. But the message was clear. Saravia was committed to military action, and they had used Victoria's intelligence to plan their approach. Defense systems are tracking 43 incoming aircraft. Defense Secretary Coleman reported from his command station. They're following flight patterns that suggest intimate knowledge of our radar coverage gaps. Alexander looked at Victoria, who was seated under guard at a side table, monitoring the communications. Her face was pale as she listened to the military coordination taking place around her. "Those are the gaps you identified and reported," he said to her. "Yes," she confirmed quietly. "I mapped your entire air defense network over several years of observing military exercises and reviewing classified briefings." King Edmund turned toward her, his expression a mixture of pain and fury. "You gave them everything they needed to attack us effectively."
Before Victoria could respond, Intelligence Chief Morrison rushed into the room with an urgent report.
"Your Majesty, we're receiving communications from the Saravian government. They're demanding immediate negotiations for what they're calling territorial adjustments and political reforms." Translation: "Surrender," Prime Minister Davidson said grimly. "There's more," Morrison continued. "They're specifically demanding that Queen Vivian be turned over to them as part of any negotiated settlement. They claim she's a Saravian citizen being held against her will." Alexander felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. They're not just extracting their spy, they're using her as justification for this entire operation. They can claim they're rescuing a kidnapped citizen while simultaneously forcing political concessions. Victoria suddenly stood up, causing her guards to step forward alertly. "I need to speak with you all immediately. There's something about this situation that doesn't make sense. You're hardly in a position to make demands." King Edmund replied coldly. "Please," Victoria said urgently. "My handlers were never authorized to trigger military action based on exposure of my operation. Someone else is directing this assault, and I think I know who." Alexander signaled for her to continue, despite the skeptical looks from the other officials. "When I was initially recruited for this mission, I was told it was part of a long-term intelligence gathering operation run by Saravia's External Intelligence Service. But the speed and coordination of this military response suggests involvement by their Military Intelligence Division, which operates independently and has a much more aggressive agenda."
"What's the difference?" Lord Thornfield asked.
"The External Intelligence Service focuses on gathering information for diplomatic and economic advantage," Victoria explained. "The Military Intelligence Division plans for and initiates actual military action. If they've taken control of my operation, it means they've been planning this invasion for months or years, using my intelligence as the foundation." Defense Secretary Coleman looked up from his communications panel. "That would explain why their attack patterns are so sophisticated. This isn't a hasty response to your exposure. It's a carefully planned operation that was waiting for an excuse to launch." Alexander realized the full scope of what had happened. "You were never just a spy. You were the advanced scout for an invasion that was always going to happen. Your exposure just gave them the justification they needed." Victoria nodded grimly.
"I think that's exactly right."
"And it means that even if we had never discovered my real identity, this attack would have happened eventually. They were just waiting for the right moment." King Edmund looked around the room at his advisors and military commanders. The situation was desperate, but at least now they understood what they were facing. "Options," he demanded. Defense Secretary Coleman had been coordinating with military commanders throughout the crisis. "Our air defenses are holding, but they're stretched thin. The enemy knows exactly where to probe for weaknesses. Ground forces are mobilizing, but they'll need 6 hours to reach full defensive positions." "Diplomatic options?" the king asked. Prime Minister Davidson shook his head. "Third-party nations are offering to mediate, but Saravia is demanding immediate capitulation to their territorial and political demands. They're not interested in real negotiation." "Intelligence options?" Morrison looked at Victoria. She could potentially provide insight into Saravian military planning, but trusting anything she says at this point. "I have a proposal," Victoria interrupted. "Let me contact my original handlers in the External Intelligence Service. If I'm right about military intelligence taking control of this operation, there might be people in the Saravian government who are opposed to this escalation."
Alexander considered the option.
"What exactly are you suggesting?" Internal Saravian politics are more complex than you might realize, Victoria explained. The External Intelligence Service and Military Intelligence Division have competing agendas. If military intelligence initiated this attack without proper authorization, there could be officials who would want to stop it before it escalates further. You're talking about encouraging a coup, Lord Thornfield observed. I'm talking about potentially preventing a war by providing information to people who might be able to recall these military units, Victoria corrected. King Edmund stared at his former wife for a long moment. Why would you help us now? After 10 years of betrayal, why should we trust anything you propose? Victoria met his eyes directly. Because despite everything I've done, I never wanted people to die. This was supposed to be an intelligence operation, not a war. If I can help prevent unnecessary bloodshed, I want to try. Before anyone could respond, alarms sounded again throughout the bunker. Coleman received another urgent communication. Saravian ground forces are crossing the border in 3 sectors, he announced. This is a full-scale invasion. The room erupted into coordinated activity as military commanders began implementing defensive strategies. Alexander found himself in the center of the crisis, helping coordinate between civilian and military leadership, while his father supervised the overall response. Over the next several hours, the situation developed rapidly. Valdorian forces engaged Saravian units along the border, while diplomatic efforts continued through international channels. The palace bunker became a nerve center for both military and political responses to the crisis. Victoria was allowed to attempt contact with her original handlers under strict supervision and with all communications monitored. What she discovered confirmed her suspicions. The External Intelligence Service had not authorized the military action and was actively working to convince Saravian leadership to halt the invasion. They're claiming this is a rescue operation for a kidnapped citizen, Victoria reported after her communication. But there are officials in the government who know that's not true and are concerned about international repercussions. Can they stop it? Alexander asked. They're trying, but military intelligence has convinced the defense minister that this is their best opportunity to resolve territorial disputes and force favorable political changes in Valdoria. The breakthrough came 18 hours into the crisis. Intelligence Chief Morrison received word that Saravian political leadership was fracturing over the invasion. Several key officials were threatening to expose the real nature of Victoria's mission if military action continued, which would undermine their justification for the attack. Simultaneously, international pressure was mounting rapidly. Neighboring countries and major world powers were demanding immediate cessation of hostilities and threatening economic sanctions against Saravia. The cost of continuing the invasion was rising rapidly. King Edmund made the decision to offer a face-saving solution to Saravian leadership. Victoria would be allowed to leave the country voluntarily, presented as a repatriation of their citizen, in exchange for immediate withdrawal of all military forces and agreement to resolve territorial disputes through international mediation. The proposal worked. Within 36 hours of the first aircraft crossing into Valdorian airspace, Saravian forces were withdrawing. Victoria Marinelli was escorted to the border under international supervision, officially ending her decade-long operation within the royal family. In the aftermath of the crisis, the true scope of the damage became clear. Victoria had indeed provided intelligence that compromised virtually every aspect of Valdorian national security. However, her final cooperation had helped prevent what could have been a devastating war. King Edmund announced his abdication 2 weeks after the crisis ended. The stress of the invasion, combined with his Parkinson's diagnosis and the devastating personal betrayal, had convinced him that he could no longer effectively serve as monarch. Prince Alexander ascended to the throne as King Alexander III, inheriting a country that had been shaken but not broken by the crisis. The new king's first major act was a complete overhaul of palace security and intelligence procedures. Captain Reed was promoted to head a new royal protection service that implemented protocols designed to prevent any similar infiltration. Background checks for anyone with access to the royal family or classified information were expanded to include verification methods that Victoria's false identity could never have passed. The parliamentary investigation into Victoria's activities led to the exposure of the corruption she had threatened to reveal. 7 members of Parliament were arrested and charged with accepting bribes during the tax reform vote. Rather than causing additional instability, the revelations strengthened public trust in the new king's commitment to transparency and accountability. King Alexander also initiated a comprehensive review of Valdoria's relationship with Saravia and other potentially hostile nations. New diplomatic protocols were established to identify and counter long-term intelligence operations, while military preparedness was enhanced to deter future attempts at coercion. Perhaps most significantly, The crisis had revealed to the Valdorian people that their monarchy was resilient enough to survive even the most devastating betrayals. King Alexander's handling of the situation, from discovering Victoria's true identity to managing the military crisis and eventual resolution, demonstrated the strength and continuity of royal leadership. Victoria Marinelli disappeared into whatever new identity her intelligence service provided for her. Her decade-long operation had ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Saravia gained no territorial concessions, forced no political changes, and found itself internationally isolated by its aggressive actions. The woman who had posed as Queen Vivian had gathered impressive amounts of intelligence, but in the end, her exposure had strengthened rather than weakened the kingdom she had been sent to undermine. King Alexander never married, dedicating himself entirely to rebuilding and strengthening the institutions that Victoria's betrayal had exposed as vulnerable. The woman who had pretended to love his father had inadvertently taught him that the monarchy's true strength lay not in the perfection of its leaders, but in their ability to overcome even the most personal and devastating challenges. The Kingdom of Valdoria emerged from the crisis more secure, more transparent, and more prepared for future challenges than it had been before Victoria Marinelli arrived at court. Her greatest deception had ultimately led to her greatest failure. A stronger and more resilient monarchy that would be far more difficult for future enemies to penetrate or destroy. Years later, when historians wrote about the crisis, they would note that sometimes the greatest threats to a kingdom come not from foreign armies or economic collapse, but from the quiet betrayal of those trusted with its most intimate secrets. But they would also note that the true measure of a monarchy's strength is not whether it can prevent such betrayals, but whether it can survive and grow stronger after they are revealed. King Alexander III ruled for 43 years, and his reign was marked by peace, prosperity, and a level of governmental transparency that became a model for democratic monarchies worldwide. The woman who had tried to destroy his family's legacy had inadvertently helped create one of the most stable and respected reigns in Valdorian history.